Are these working? Yes, they are. If I lean in. Okay. A very, very warm welcome to everyone to this event. Thank you all so much for coming. This is a research session on normativity in South Asian public culture, specifically engaging with, and I have to say, just quickly, celebrating, please. This book, Queering Normativity in South Asian Public Culture, Wrong Readings Only. This book offers a thematic examination of normativity as it impacts on gendered and sexual subjectivity. I'm Sadie, and I work in the Department of Gender Studies. You should always introduce yourself, I realise. And it's a particular pleasure to me to be chairing this event, not only because Danny is a much valued and much missed previous member of faculty in the department here, but also because the book, which I am delighted to say is on sale tonight, and it's raising money for the journal Cahol, which we will be discussing a bit later on, this book is published by Palgrave in the Thinking Gender in Transnational Times book series, a series which also has close links with the Department of Gender Studies. Many of its current and past series editors are here tonight, myself included, and I'm going to shamelessly use my chair's privilege to remind everyone that we are always interested in radical and exciting new book proposals. Okay, so Danny's fantastic book in the series demonstrates, as I say, how normativity functions by querying that which appears natural or ostensibly normal in South Asian public culture. It engages with the consolidation and unsettling of normativity through cultural artifacts of nation states, contestations around gender and feminism in canonical and popular texts, as well as the imbrication of caste inequality within South Asian gay positionalities. And tonight, we're going to bring together academics and practitioners engaged in contesting normativity in the fields of gender, sexuality, and South Asian cultural studies to try to build a space of critical participatory dialogue. And I'm just about to introduce our speakers. And just to say that the way that this is going to work is that they will each speak for around 10 minutes. Expanding on the contestations with normativity in South Asian public culture, but addressing specifically how normativity features or is critiqued both in their research and or in relation to the book. And we'll then invite further participation from the floor to continue to build on this dialogue. So I know that Danny is expecting and hoping for as much participation as possible. So we really will try and keep as much time available for that part. So very quickly, I'm going to introduce our panel. Joe from LSE Anthropology, although it doesn't say so in my notes, so I nearly forgot, is a writer activist, trained in participatory, feminist and ethnographic research methods. Their doctoral research with the National Network of Sex Workers, activists and filmmakers patched together a world of crisis, resilience, response and celebration built by sex workers in the network. They're currently working on projects exploring the intersection of bureaucracy and sex worker activism in India, anti-trans violence, death and regeneration in queer trans collectives in India. I think a round of applause for each speaker as they're introduced. This should be the new normal, or anti-normal, whichever. Okay. I'm going to introduce Danny, an independent academic researching the complex intersections of South Asian culture and Inter-Asia queer praxis and theory. They're the co-founder of Queer Asia, a network and platform for inter-Asia collaboration and dialogue, active since 2016 in London, Berlin, and recently growing in Delhi. They work as the Associate Programme Director of the Rhodes Scholarship at the University of Oxford and as an Associate Consultant with Delta, a leadership and equity consultancy. As you all know, they are the author of Queering Normativity in South Asian Public Culture, as well as the co-editor of Queer Asia, Decolonising and Reimagining Sexuality and Gender, which was published in 2019. Next to Danny is Rohit, Associate Professor in Gender and Sexuality here at the Department of Gender at LSE and Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the University of Glasgow. His research explores the relationship between sexuality, class and belonging in contemporary India and the diaspora. He is the author of Digital Queer Cultures in India, Politics, Intimacies and Belonging from 2017 and co-author of the forthcoming Desi Queers, LGBTQ+ South Asians and Cultural Belonging in Britain, which is coming out this year. Yay! Shannon on my far right, I hate saying far right, is absolutely not on the far right, is Assistant Professor in the Sociology of Gender and Sexuality at the University of Cambridge and Fellow at Girton College, Cambridge, and also an ex-member of our department too. So welcome back. I haven't finished. His research focuses on the relationship between masculinities, femininities and sexualities in cities of the global south. He's the author of Becoming Young Men in New India, Masculinities, Gender Relations and Violence in the Post-Colony from 2022, and has carried out long-term ethnographic and qualitative fieldwork in New Delhi and Johannesburg, exploring questions of men's violence towards women and queer people, embodied performance of class, gender and sexuality, as well as the transforming articulations of heteropatriarchal and heteronormative power. Okay, so the order in which we're going to speak is it's going to be Rohit, Joe, then Shannon, and then Danny will speak back, I suppose, or add to. Oh, you're going to start. They've changed their minds so many times, the most unruly panel. Okay. Danny. Yes. Yes. Anti-normative paneling. Here you go.
Thank you. And so I just wanted to start actually by just saying an enormous thanks. This kind of event back in the department feels a little bit like a homecoming for me. I've spent so much time over the course of the pandemic and before that teaching in the department, and getting to know some amazing people who work here and so many amazing students. So I'm just really deeply grateful for being here and for talking about this book here with all of you, and to celebrate the conversation and our sort of like thinking together that has happened over many courses. Sometimes reading people, I'm like, oh, actually that's my friend, and then it goes into the book, and it's such a joyful moment for me. So I just wanted to start with that thanks. And part of that process of being in the department, something that I have really deeply cherished, is that sense of collaborative, collective, constant learning. And for me, the rewriting of this book, I guess, from the PhD thesis into this format, was that process of collective learning, collective rediscovery, moments of insight that I wasn't looking for, but that actually came from so many different angles. Because when you do the PhD, you've gone through this trauma, and then you're like, oh, hang on a second, there's actually joy on the other side of that. And this book, in many ways, represents a little bit of that. So one of the things that we thought we'd talk about and we'd open the conversation with was the question of how normativity features or gets critiqued in our work, in our research, and in the book. And so I'll start just a little bit by talking about this book and the work that it does on normativity. And I think one of the things that I was really struggling with when I was finally almost done with the book was choosing the book cover, because I was like, what do I put in there from this stock of images that I had to choose from? And what I've got there on the cover of the book, and there's copies there, is this image of a glitch. It to me stood out in many ways because of the way in which thinking about the normativity required constant rewiring of the ways in which I thought of the subjectivity that I had sort of internalized, or grown up or grown into or grown out of. And so many of those questions kept coming back to me as an encounter that felt very glitchy constantly. So I started with that image of the glitch because it, in many ways, is the work that this book does in diving into what often is the garbled nature of norms and their interweaving that doesn't necessarily become apparent or clear, rather appears constantly as commonsensical, as something that is, given. And there's this, there's many phrases that we can latch on to, and we've seen or we've heard. So I opened the book with a set of quotes, but one of the phrases that I think through or think with in this text is in Hindi, the words "log kya kahenge." For those of you who understand Hindi, that's something that we hear commonly, but it's translated into, "Oh, what will people say?" Like it has that affect of shame, right? And it can be deployed at any point of time against a whole variety of acts, of identities, of conversations even. So I was thinking about this moment of shame as an affect being used to discipline bodies, discipline identities, discipline people into conforming, and thinking really about how it is and when it is and where it is that we encounter the normal. And the first chapter, very in a very banal way, says the normal is everywhere. Because that encounter is not located in a specific place. So the challenge for the book and the work that this book does is that it's a constant and unrelenting tracing of how the normal works, how it shows up, where it appears, and when it is deployed and when it is internalized by subjects and subjectivity, in order to create an environment in which that power structure that we know as normativity continues to thrive and continues to get reinforced. So I wanted to kind of bring it back a little bit to my personal context, and this is something that I was thinking a lot about, how much of it to put into the book. And I did put a little bit of this into the book, but not a lot, because at some point I realized that I wasn't ready to actually talk about some of those aspects. But these personal contexts included sort of growing up in North India from a South Indian Telugu background, but also from an Anglo-Indian background, from growing up in a very Hindu-dominant society in a Christian family, from navigating queerness within that Christianity, and of course, on top of that, the intersection of feminists and masculinity, especially in a place like Delhi, that has, and Shannon's work talks a lot about masculinity in those contexts, where there is this virile masculinity that oppresses any other kind of masculinity, but also femininity and women, and other genders and people from different sexual identities. So these intersections were really difficult to navigate, and it brings me back to that glitch, because it felt like each intersection was a glitch in reading the previous intersection, right? The Christianity didn't fit with the queerness, or the queerness didn't fit with the masculinity, or the Anglo-Indianness didn't fit with the Hindu dominant or Hindi dominant majority. The Telugu bit was always a little astray, so it felt like each moment was a glitch. So when I was doing this research and I was thinking about this question of, what is the normal, how is it produced, where is it produced, and how do we internalize this across so many contexts, I keep coming back to this moment of the glitch and thinking about those intersections as they rub up against each other or rub up against different aspects. So the work that this book does in critiquing normativity is thinking about the way in which normativity as a power structure is embedded in our society, in our culture, and how it constantly replicates itself. So it does this sort of in ways that I call it in the book, I call it the invisibility paradox of normativity, where I borrow from Sedgwick and a few other queer theorists to think through two axioms, basically, to try and engage with the question of normativity. So the first axiom that I use is that normativity makes invisible its own production, right? We're never encountering it in itself. We're always sort of lost in the symptoms of its effects, right? So whether this is countering anti-caste, caste hatred, whether it is countering class hatred, whether it's countering gender or sexual hatred, or all kinds of hegemonic discourses and power structures. So what I wanted to do is task a queer archive in this book to trace the way in which normativity is working through these many slippages that function in some ways like distractions. And I always, in my mind, I always go back to that image of pardon the RuPaul reference of, Jada Pinkett Smith going, look over there, right? That's kind of how, in my head, normativity is working. The minute you trap it, or minute you start thinking about it, a distraction has come in from somewhere else, right? And distracted you and said, oh, but these are our others. These are the enemies that we need to focus on. And let's start talking about them. In many ways, the way in which Foucault talks about, right, the incitement to discourse is always the burden of the other. So what I'm doing in this book is reversing that. I'm inciting normativity into discursiveness so as to reveal its contradictions and its interlocutions in the way in which it wraps us up and recreates certain subject effects and subjectivity. The second axiom that I use in this book is in many ways Althusserian. It looks at the way in which this normativity is internalized and is replicated by subjects. So how we're all constantly interpellated by normativity in order to reproduce that, right? It could be very deeply we're internalizing the shame affect and replicating it on ourselves, policing even if it's our bodies or our gendered expressions, or policing the ways in which other people behave. And for me, what was really interesting when I was thinking this through, in terms of who's in the book, right? What's in the book? Where are my moments of examination going to be, or what is in the queer archive, so to speak? One of the things I didn't want to do was look at self-identified same-sex sexual identities. What I instead wanted to do was look at the way in which normativity is functioning in what is the ostensibly normal, right? So I look at the moments where even in some of the novels of Rabindranath Tagore, we talk about how these what I call contra-normative acts occur. These are acts that are discontinuous, acts that are not necessarily cognizant of the force of normativity, but how they constantly occur but are subsumed under this larger sort of morass of normativity or the normal, right? And so just to give you a very specific example, there's this beautiful moment in Tagore's novels where his heterosexually paired heroine is, in a love triangle with a friend, her husband's friend. And in order to articulate that desire is coded under, questions of culture or questions of tradition or religious, over subscription to religious deification, almost like, but this also happens in Hindu religion, for instance, right? So look at the pairing of Radha and Krishna, for instance. And these kinds of, like these kinds of astray or contra-normative sex acts, if you will, are subsumed under the discourse of, but this is fine because this is part of the hegemonic dominant, right? So what I'm trying to do throughout the archive is locate these moments that have contra-normative sex acts, but not let them subsume within the normative, but actually talk about what is the effect that that is happening when we investigate them. What power structures come crawling out to shut that down, right? Shut those readings down, so it were. And whether it's through violence, whether it's through censorship, whether it is through other kinds of disciplinary mechanisms, right? Even sometimes lack of funding is a disciplinary mechanism, as the first chapter traces. So what the work that this queer archive is doing is to be unrelenting about how normativity functions and how it sort of gets buried and then replicated within subjectivity. So what I wanted to just sort of think about is, by focusing on the not focusing on the symptoms of the effects, but on normativity itself as a power structure, that is what I call as queering normativity, a questioning of normativity that constantly locates and sutures together contra-normative and anti-normative sexual acts in order to create a structure of solidarity whereby we're able to see and recognize how normativity is functioning, where its impositions are, and where these can be teased apart. And methodologically, this is very cultural studies sort of working through this text, where you pick a string and you just really pull it till you see all of the seams start to come apart. And so for example, in the first chapter, what I look at is the figure of Rabindranath Tagore, who is in many ways hailed as a nationalist hero, but also a pan-Asian hero for winning the Nobel Prize, right? The first Asian to win the Nobel Prize, and sort of tease apart what happens when he wins the Nobel Prize to his thinking that is contra-normative, right? Whether this is thinking about education, whether this is thinking about sexuality, whether it's thinking about the role of women. And I constantly locate through that the disciplinary structures that are coming in to shut down that kind of reading of Tagore, right? So that is to give you an example. So the second chapter does this with the interlocutions, particularly through two canonical texts, an American journalist, Catherine Mayo's book Mother India, which was used to perpetuate colonial rule over South Asia, and a Hindi film director, Mehboob Khan's film Mother India, which is seen as a right back. But what happens in the process is the way in which women in South Asia get embedded under this structure of what it means to be a good woman, and are constantly forced to replicate that structure and internalize that structure. So I juxtapose this interlocution with a BBC documentary called India's Daughter, which talks about the rape and sexual violence towards Jyoti Singh, and think through the ways in which we're encountering the force of normativity through these many power dynamics. The third chapter sort of looks at the same-sex marriage, particularly, and it does this through what is hailed as, and I don't know if it's correct or not, but it's always been hailed as that, India's first gay matrimony ad, and how even within same-sex sexuality, caste discrimination gets replicated, and looks at the way in which caste discrimination is such a deep layer of normativity buried even in what is quote-unquote progressive sexual identities. And then the final chapter, which is kind of a look forward, if you will, talks about the representation of women particularly in mainstream cinema in Bollywood, and the representation of men, but looking at the ways in which neoliberal consumerist culture enables certain articulations of same-sex sexual identity to be represented but depoliticized and completely, isolated or individualized, and what that does for people who are relying on that kind of a product in the market to create a diversified commodity. So that's broadly the overview of the book, and I'm really looking forward to some of these interventions and conversations. Yeah.
Back again to Dani's work on Tagore. And perhaps as the only Bengali on this panel, it falls on me to, of course, say a few more words on this, right? So Dani notes rightly that Tagore is an artifact of South Asian popular culture who has been reduced and simplified under the aegis of normativity and nationalism. Let's take the circulation of Tagore, for example, as has been mobilized in recent days during the building of the Ram Mandir in India and the critique of Hindu nationalism, where progressive and left-wing activists have indeed unmoored Tagore from their respectable codes to also suggest Tagore's internationalism and a critique of the normative patriotism might actually have been construed as anti-national, or the epithet urban nakshal that so many critics of the Indian government are labeled with. A point I know Daniel makes in their analysis of Sugata Bose's famous speech in Parliament. Indeed, in many ways, the digital sphere has allowed for a more radical circulation of Tagore here. Tagore is also a queer character, both in ways in which their stories have circulated through films such as Shokhir Bali, which again Dani mentions in their book, Ghore Baire, Chitrangada, or queer memes, and even the gender fluidity, gender queerness, for example, in famous Brajboli songs, such as the Bhanu Singho's Podaboli, for those of you who know it, again, where a 17-year-old boy, Bhanu Singh, sings of his love for the male god Krishna, which circulates in queer digital Bengali spaces. I'll just read a little bit out, why not? So they say in the song, Gahana Kusum Kunjamaje, Mridula Madhura Bangshi Baje, Bisara Tarasa Lokalaje, Sajni Aulo, which basically translates as deep in the, I know it's going to sound a bit too much, deep in the arbor, flute sound hover, come on darling, shake off fear and blushing, clad in all blue robes in his heart is a lustful rose. Lovely. Okay. Moving on again to Dani's book where Dani talks about caste no bar. So let me move to this example that Dani provides. And I've written about this elsewhere as well. In this case from 2015, Padma Iyer, a mother of queer activist Harish Iyer, placed an advertisement seeking a groom for her son in the matrimonial section of the tabloid newspaper Midday. The advertisement reads, seeking, 25, well settled, vegetarian, animal loving, groom for my son Harish. Caste no bar, Iyer preferred. Iyer claimed that 3 major newspapers refused to carry the advertisement because it was illegal on the basis of the pertaining to a same-sex relationship. While several newspapers and media outlets, both in India and the West, and in fact, I think Stephen Fry did a thing about this in BBC, have celebrated this advert as a significant and provocative exemplar of queer rights in action, one, of course, that is signified through the heteronormative marriage. On closer inspection, the advert reveals some of the complex ways in which queerness and social identity is reflected in contemporary India. The advert openly seeks well-placed, so read that as upper class, Iyer preferred, read that as upper caste, groom, for sanctioned matrimony in a state which until then upheld IPC 377, which criminalized consensual non-heteronormative sex. Caste preference far from subverts tradition. The kind of scenario described evokes complex resonances for imagining same-sex desires and a queer politics of normativity in India. I'm going to conclude. My critique of normativity is about presenting new ways of imagining sexual politics and its interimbrication with digital technologies and Hindu nationalism within present-day India, and presenting a cautionary note towards celebrating the digital sphere as a utopic space of queer freedom. At the same time, gesturing to the potentials within intimate formations forged on digital platforms that can undercut the neoliberal disciplining of bodies and pleasures. Thank you.
So a lot of my hopefully brief, I'm timing it, brief comments will build on everything Dani has been saying and a lot of what Rohit has been saying as well. And I've written Dr. Luther everywhere, so I'm going to keep tripping.
I had Luther written as well.
Yeah, so that's going to happen. And I apologize if you can hear my heartbeat louder than my voice. I'm quite nervous. But yes, hopefully the adrenaline will kick in in time. Hi, I'm Jo, as Sadie said. I am at the anthropology department. I didn't mention that in my bio, but I am. I'm very proud of it. I'm at LSE Anthropology. I'm a fellow there. There was a boo. Okay, thanks. I heard you. And a lot of the work that I do is about marginalized communities and their experiences with violence and despite it, as the bio says. I'd like to, I think, start by saying I'm just happy to be having this conversation with Danny and Shannon again, because this is the second relay that we're a part of. The first relay, I could not talk about my research much, but I'm glad that I'm able to actually connect a lot of these things. And Danny made me watch Mother India. They didn't.
I didn't.
They didn't. I think I was a little too committed. And I went and watched Mother India, and I'm really depressed now.
Oh.
So maybe drinks will help after this, and talking about Mother India and processing that. So that is all to say that I will mostly be focusing on the third chapter of the book that focuses on Mother India and good womanhood, because I work with sex workers. But anyway, just to begin with, and to speak a little bit about what I think about and where I'm coming from. I tend to talk a lot about dreaming and imagining worlds when we aren't responding continuously to violence, because every time I tell somebody that I work on violence, people will expect a certain thing from my work, but it's actually quite far from it. It's mostly about how to imagine worlds where we're not responding constantly to violence. In particular, I work with queer trans collectives and sex workers collectives in India, in South India specifically. My doctoral research was on sex workers collectives in 8 states in India. I did most of my fieldwork was in Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, for those of you who know where those states are. And South India is where I am from. And these are also places where sex workers have been organizing and responding to bad film on them. So I've looked at documentary film where they're responding to police violence and making their own spaces, and they're responding to life beyond healthcare interventions that is forced upon them sometimes. And they're also looking beyond forced victimhood, which is something that they have to constantly fight. My work is also very much about me, as it is about my interlocutors and finding ways towards collective liberation, because I think a lot of my work is about the solidarity that I can't find sometimes between queer trans spaces and sex worker spaces in India. But we can talk about that more in questions if you're curious. So by definition, and keeping in mind the theme of the event, both my interlocutors and I are in many ways out of the norm. Me for being trans, them for being sex workers, and maybe that's where the solidarity began. The sex workers I work with are the antithesis to the Mother India that Danny discusses in chapter 2 of the book, to the Nari that they talk about, or the lady, that's the translation, that Mother India is. The sex workers are the Aurat, which is translated to the public woman, the uncouth and unhonorable woman who is probably wearing her sari wrong, speaking in profanities, is too loud, very unladylike. Should I stand up, because I'm feeling like people can't see me? I am small. I'm sorry.
Do you want to stand over here? That might be. Oh,
Fine. And this is deeply ingrained. If you are someone who is expected to conform to womanhood in India, you are taught the distinction early on. Like my father said, I was not allowed to cut my hair because South Indian girls should have long hair. I asked him to grow his own hair if he liked hair that much. But anyway, that was not taken very well. And on a macro scale, sex workers have to fight more than a couple of norms that have been created by a range of actors. Of course, there is the good woman norm that they have to fight. There is the good woman, bad woman dichotomy that they have to deal with. There are Indian societal expectations of sex workers, either as lone, street-walking women. When I say the phrase Indian sex worker, and you close your eyes, you immediately know what I'm talking about. That image has been put in our head. It's not normal. And they're also looked at as destroyers of families, the dishonored woman who did choose the last resort, unlike Mother India, who kept her honor. For those of you who have watched Mother India or who have not watched Mother India, she, out of desperation, chooses, we can talk about choice later, to have sex with a person who is a landlord, but then in the end says, you know what, I'm not going to do that because I am not going to fall to that level. So this idea of somebody falling to that level is something also which is not normal. It is put into our head. There are global funding organizations that expect only certain sex worker stories to be told for the funds to be given to those who deserve things. Deserve is underlined. Who deserves anything? European and American funded films that I look at on sex work that focus on victimhood and disease, and more so on a sense of poverty that fits the construction of post-colonial India. Think yellow filters, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Think Slumdog Millionaire, right? Rags to riches, exoticism. There is a sex worker in Slumdog Millionaire as well. Because if you want to talk about crime and you want to talk about grime and you want to talk about rats scurrying around, you talk about sex work. Also images put in our head. And that's what my thesis is about, images put in our head. And often not the lived reality. And these are just some of the norms that have to be fought and that sex workers are constantly fighting. The chapter on Mother India in particular had me thinking back to particular instances from when I was on field with the National Network of Sex Workers in India. And thinking about nationality and how sex workers deal with the idea of the nation state. Because for me, the nation state has always been something that I have to fight as a queer trans person, but that doesn't exactly translate in the same way. I don't just mean as the state itself that portrays itself as a savior to these women, because that happens a lot. Instead, I'm thinking about how sex workers, and for that matter, many marginalized groups, find ways to assert themselves as those who belong in the nation. And they want to be seen as those who belong in the nation, because for so long, they haven't been made to feel like they belong, just like any other rights-bearing citizens might belong. So we have seen this happening in countless protests when the constitution is used by multiple groups to talk about the right to the state, the right to be citizens, and the right to space, whether that might be metaphorical space, public space, historical space, just a space in history, and also space in their personal lives to just be able to do whatever they want to do. So for example, to assert that they also belong in the nation state of India, sex workers actively participate in district and state democratic processes very intentionally. They all regularly vote, and that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that they take pictures of themselves voting and put it on their Instagram to show that they're voting and that they are part of the voting and the democratic process. Similarly, they read the preamble to the Constitution of India annually during their celebration of Ambedkar Jayanti, which is the celebration of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who's an emancipatory figure for multiple oppressed communities in India. We can talk about that more as well in the question session. During one particular incident while I was doing my fieldwork, I was in a board meeting in Andhra Pradesh because I was also the communications coordinator with the network. So I was just part of a lot of board meetings that went on for a lot of time and was spoken in 8 languages, and I was translating 4 of them. It was a lot, you know. And this was in Andhra Pradesh, South India, and a community leader was asked to open the meeting with some good words or whatever she wanted to open the meeting with. She chose to open the meeting by singing Vande Mataram, which is also, it's India's national song, and there is some very interesting, Danny has also covered Vande Mataram as a song, and it is the most reduced way to say that is it's a nationalistic symbol. On asking her why, because I was quite confused about why she was singing Vande Mataram at the beginning of a board meeting, she said that it represents the freedom struggle for her and all the other workers over there, the Indian freedom struggle from 1947. One that sex workers still feel like they are fighting. They actually feel like they're constantly fighting in the Indian freedom struggle. They invoke the freedom struggle actively in conversations to talk about a new India in which they, sex workers, are feminist change makers. But this is not new. During the actual independence struggle in India in around the 1940s, the wives or courtesans, some of who did sex work, but most of who were dancers, singers, musicians, approached the Congress party that was at the helm of the struggle in the hopes of joining the actions in Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh, North India. Mahatma Gandhi, who everybody knows, I hope who Gandhi is, yes, okay, said that they were not welcome insinuating that the national freedom struggle only had space for women who did not engage in dishonoring jobs. In response, and heartbroken, and this is one of those stories that I say and it always breaks my heart again. These are musicians, I'm telling you, and so you might also feel heartbroken. They felt unwanted in the space, and they actually went and threw their instruments in the Ganga, in the Ganges, saying, if you are not going to involve us in the nationalist struggle for the fight for our own country, I will throw all my, and yeah, I don't know, I find that really sad. So yeah, they threw their instruments in the Ganga and they started making their songs, which had beautiful sexual imagery before that, into nationalistic songs. Hindustani music, the stalwarts of Hindustani music are the wives. Hindustani music did not start randomly from upper class Brahmin men starting to sing it. It started from the wives, and it was mostly appropriated from them. So a lot of the new Hindustani classical music that we hear now has different words, has euphemisms for sex, mostly does not talk about sex. And if you are interested in that, you should read Sabha Devan's book, The Wife Nama, and watch the documentary The Other Song that specifically talks about one song that has gone through those changes, and Sabha tries to trace back what the song actually sounded like and what the words actually were. And it was a painstaking process, and I love that movie. So if you want to watch that, you should. So sex workers still are at the forefront of and will be the first to support progressive movements in India, because they feel like they have been outside of and weighed down by the norm for ages. And they tend to feel shifts first. It's always the marginalized who feel, the shifts of anything. They actually have their finger at the heartbeat of whatever's happening in the country, whether it's the economy or anything else. So Molly Smith and Juno Mack were right when in the book Revolting Prostitutes, they said that sex workers are the original feminists. Wherever you look, the first people who will push against a norm that usually also affects them first because they're on the margins are sex workers. For an easy example, Marsha P. Johnson was a sex worker. Even though not all the wives are sex workers, the stigma attached to entertainment, the entertainment industry at that time has affected multiple communities, so much so that it has created a break in solidarity within these communities as well, who all have to deal with the same issue. Because the wives were punished for engaging in sex work, as were bar dancers with the Bombay Dance Bar Act, they were all punished together under immoral trafficking acts, which not only conflates adult consensual sex work with trafficking, but also any form of entertainment that might have an element of sexuality in it. Women's sexuality, as we know, has been the first to be controlled before anything else, whether colonially or within new post-colonial states. Oh no, I'm very, very over time. Okay, so last thing I'm going to say, which I found really, really interesting, was that in 1956, they did have an immoral suppression, All India Suppression of Immoral Traffic Act that was passed in 1956. The interesting part in that is the abbreviation of that act is Sita. For those of you who know who Sita is the person who is rescued by Ram, who is now a very famous figure in India for reasons. And Sita is Ram's wife. So the whole thing about rescue and removal and saving and victimhood and the state has been tied even in the abbreviations that we use to actually save these sex workers without ever asking them whether they want to be saved, what happens after they're saved. And the fact that if you want to get out of a rescue home in India as a sex worker, even if you're 40 years old, a male member of your family has to come rescue you out of there. Even if you're 40 years old, a 10-year-old boy can come and sign you out. So lots to say there, and I have 4 more paragraphs that I will cover when we are talking.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll go straight off. I'm delighted to be here talking to friends, colleagues back at LSE Gender Studies, so it's wonderful to be back here. I work on masculinities and questions of young men and what it means to be a man in contemporary India. And I've been thinking about Danny's book in relation to my own work and my book and how it all connects together. And I have a few sort of set of comments to make in primarily really around 4 major themes. And they are around the body, around sexuality, around violence, and around the nation. And I try and sort of weave things together in that. Yeah, they were making fun of me. Oh, we were all laughing that I haven't prepared notes, so I'm trying to wing it. But I have been thinking about the book and reflecting on it. And so I think what is very striking about the way Danny has thought about normativity is how scholars have also thought about masculinities, where masculinities have often also been thought about as the unmarked gender, right? Where masculinities or patriarchal ideas of gender are everywhere, but they are still nowhere to be found. When we think about gender, women become the marked body and men are somehow the unmarked, the invisible, the omnipresent, against which we need to have women's empowerment, or women need to be brought in, or various programs have to sort of take place. So for me, the question of thinking about normativity is also, in my own way, thinking about masculinities and visibilizing masculinities and starting to see how masculinities are operating, brought about, constructed, and even materialized in an everyday sense. I think Danny's theorization of the normative is absolutely fundamental in how we might think about masculinities and why it matters, right? Why the politics of it matters. So to think particularly about young men and the body. So when I was doing fieldwork in India, and I'm an ethnographer, a sociologist, so I did qualitative interviews and conversations with young men. One of the sites that I did ethnographic work was in a gym. And I was looking and talking to young men about the gym and what they do in the gym, why they're in the gym. And it's absolutely why they're in the gym, why I was ever in the gym. The big puzzle. So one of the chapters in my book is about the gym, and so I was reflecting on Danny's work on the body. And these men are so clear that to have a masculine body means a certain aesthetic, right? To have that body means you have to put in labor to produce that body, right? And so for that, it was very clear that to have a masculine body, you had to have the right kind of V. So all of these boys were very interested in building their biceps, their chests, and making them quite big in this V formation. Right? And at the gym, I became a subject for my informants because they kept saying that, I had the wrong V. And so throughout the gym and there's these conversations with these young men, it was all about how I need to correct my V to become more like them and have this correct V. Right? And on a deeper level, it was about what it meant to embody masculinity, or what a man's body is supposed to look like, the norms around what a masculine body is like and needs to appear like, right? So what I found very striking is the anxiety that is provoked by normativity, right? The anxiety of trying to fit into this norm, of trying to become this norm. And that's the title of my book. It's called Becoming Young Men. Because gender or masculinity or man is not a category that exists. It's not already there. There is a social process of becoming, right? From Butler and so on and so forth, we can think about this. And that process of producing masculinity, becoming a masculine subject, is a deeply power-laden subject. And that's, again, something quite important that Danny's work is pointing out, that power is everywhere and it's nowhere. And that's, in fact, its power. That power of masculinity and defining what a man is so invisible, right? And for me, it became then the task of ethnographically revealing this power, of just demonstrating how this power operates, how this norm is brought about, how it's constructed, how it's practiced. The second set of thoughts and reflections are around sexuality. So these young men have to again construct masculinity or become men, and heterosexuality is a central part of what it means to be a man or become a man. Right? For all of these young men, it was very difficult to imagine a life beyond heteronormative frameworks or heteronormative life worlds. And so for me, in my work, it almost became not even important to ask them what their sexuality was or what they identified as a label of straight or gay. And I was very interested in studying how the messy dimensions of sexuality actually play out in their everyday lives. And what was very striking was this normative or discursive level at which all of these people are straight, right? They are all talking about how they are these straight men, they will have these straight wives and marry and all of that. Yet that's not an everyday reality. Joe, one of your sentences when you were speaking, Joe, was that norms are not everyday realities. And in my case too, these young men were having all kinds of queer desires. They were having all kinds of queer sexual activities. But that could not become part of their identity. That could not question this broader sense of being this gendered, masculine, heteropatriarchal subject, right? And in that dynamic, what also became very interesting is that they viewed sexuality in particular ways. Their bodies, or the masculine body, was the desexualized body. It was not a sexualized body. But women's bodies are these hypersexualized bodies, right? Where there's a lot of, particularly in a normative sense, where there's a lot of projection of the woman in these hypersexualized ways and hypersexualized language for these men. And they would think of themselves as not really having anything to be gazed at, to be looked at, right? And so queer sex, whenever they would have it, would be fun, would be inconsequential. It's not altering the norms of heteropatriarchy that need to remain, right? That need to be established. What we are doing is just fun. It's just light, inconsequential fun. And that doesn't take away from masculinities or from any of it. And so both the body and sexuality are sort of linked to each other in how they produce the norms, as well as the gaps or the breakdowns of the norms too, right? The anxieties around the norms of making sure that they are upheld somehow. So a lot of the young men, for example, could never dream of ever making it public that they do have queer sex in between or in uncertain occasions, right? It was just not acceptable because the ways in which the norms were constructed, it would destabilize their masculinity, their entire social world, and their identities and selves of being these gendered subjects, right? The third set of themes was around violence, and Joe, I think again you touched on the violence of sex work. But this particular, I mean, my interest in masculinities was after this very one graphic rape of this young woman that took place in New Delhi back in 2012, and some of us might know it already. Anyway, so Delhi was at that point labeled as the rape capital of the world, right? And Delhi masculinity was something that was coming up about how these men are just out of control and violent. So when I was in Delhi, and that's where I did my fieldwork, I was very curious to talk to men about violence and gendered violence. And it was very clear. They had very set tropes and highly sensitized tropes on what violence was and how it was happening, right? So there was a very normative understanding of violence, what I want to suggest. Because for them, violence was something that the poor men were doing. Violence in India and Delhi was something only the poor and the uneducated man does. He is the unenlightened, the non-modern, the primitive masculine being whose sexuality is out of control. Whereas these men, with their gyms and their appropriate normative frameworks and their aspirational approaches to being an Indian citizen, were the right kinds of men. You know, they wanted to protect women. And protection was, of course, another language for control, and that's what I explore in the book. But this normative idea, often mirroring the state discourse and policy discourse, that it's the poor or the uneducated who do violence. And if we get rid of poverty, if we just educate poor men, somehow violence will disappear, right? Violence will not take place anymore. And so these wealthy men, these middle-class men, often would hide their masculine privilege beyond sort of class privilege and construct this relational dynamic with these poorer men on whom there's quite a lot of norms and quite a lot of dimensions written up already. And that's linked to the nation itself, where the normative citizen in India, as Rohit, you were saying, is the middle-class, aspirational, well-to-do neoliberal subject, right? The young men who have jobs, who can speak English, who go overseas, who have good jobs. The poor, the uneducated, the migrant, the lower caste body is not the ideal citizen, right? They are no longer the desirable citizen. And again, there is so much anxiety in projecting the norm of India as this developed nation, right? Where poverty doesn't exist, or when it is, it's about to go, right? So for young men that I was working with, they were also very anxious about the nation. Rohit, you mentioned again the consumer citizen that Annie, you've written about, right? These young men were ideal consumer citizens, and that was what being the right kind of Indian man was, right? And Joe, you talked about Mother India. Yeah. So they were very anxious about who is Mother India, or what is Mother India in contemporary the contemporary context, right? For them, they were in service of a consumer nation, of a mother India that is a globalizing, liberalizing shopping mall, perhaps, right? And they are these anxious sons of India who have to consume properly, who need to know the codes of consumption and embodiment and walking around the streets properly. Right? They cannot be the lumpen, rural, uneducated, not knowing how to consume man. Right? There's great anxiety in projecting this masculine, classist image of India and embodying that image. Right? And whilst trying to hide away the deep inequality, the continuing poverty, the deep urban violences that exist right around caste, race, and class lines. So in that sense, your idea of normativity is so powerful because it captures so many dimensions of what's happening at the body, at levels of sexuality, at levels of violence, but also the level of the nation itself. And that's what I was very struck by. And to perhaps just conclude my set of reflections, what I think is quite interesting and important maybe for us to think about is that the norms are also not lived realities, as you were saying, Joe. They have a function, they are performing a purpose in society, right? But everyday lives also exceed the norms or exceed the expectations of what these norms are supposed to be. And how does one think about that? What do we do about everyday life and the messiness of everyday lives that go beyond the norm, right? Beyond the expectation? So in the case of these young men, in the way I was thinking about it, their lives cannot be captured just by the norms alone, but they are anxious about the norms because they are profound in what they are doing and how they are shaping what a man is supposed to be in New India today, right? And I think for us as queer feminists, as political thinkers, as sociologists, as gender studies scholars, it might be interesting to think about what we could do to exploit this gap between the norms and everyday realities, right? Like how could we use that for queer feminist political purposes, right? Revealing to men that they are not actually the norms can do a lot of things. It can crumble their worlds, but it could do, also, multiple things, which I'm still thinking about. So I'll stop there and maybe there'll be more chat.
Yeah.
You can use the questions to reflect. And then I'll give you a minute at the end. Okay, hi everybody. I'm just discussing with my panelists what we're doing next. Okay, we do very much want to open up. So although Danny was going to be given an opportunity to just reflect, but actually we want to open up straight away because we're cognizant of the time. So can I collect a few yes? I've got one there. Do we have one? Okay, so let's start with 3 and then we'll do a second round. So person in pink hat, person in front, and then person here, please.
Hi, Daniel, if it's okay.
Yeah, please.
I'm Sindhura, and I'm a PhD researcher in the Media and Communications Department. I really loved your talk. In the beginning, you mentioned about shame as an affect, and I was really looking forward to hearing more about that. I'm also interested in affect, that's why, but not just shame as disciplining, and perhaps that's not part of your book, but I was also wondering what you would think about shame as transformative, as possibly revolutionary, especially when experienced by those in power or with privilege. I think their conversations around white guilt or upper caste guilt, Savarna victimhood, kind of also highlight this fear of the person in power to experience that shame that comes with it, but it can be very transformative. So what do you think of that to fight normativity and things like that? Thank you.
Hi, my first musing was the composition of the panel. I'm not an academic, so have Bengali Brahmins been unseated from academic history? Is it the time of the South Indians now? I mean, that was my first impression. But my question is, and I think Shannon sort of touched on it towards the end, what sort of possibilities do you think this scholarship offers for queer politics and queer protest, whether that be in South Asia or elsewhere?
Yeah, I was just wondering about the kind of relationship between queering normativity and the opposite, homonormativity or homonationalism, as Rohit has discussed, both of you as well. And a lot of the talks were covering sort of how normativity is a source of ascendancy for marginalized people. And they use it in different ways, finding the others that can be exploited for the leveraging. But you began with, Danny, talking about let's elicit conversations from the norm and getting the norm to be the queer space. And I want to hear more about that part as well of the normativity and queer equation.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And I'd also like invite any of the panelists into the conversation. So I'll just, I mean, these are really great provocations, and maybe I'll just do very quick reflections to some of those questions, and then just ask all of you, because I think there's so much in what you've also said that responds to some of these questions. So with the question from Sindhura on shame as an affect, I think the chapter on Mother India does do some of that work, particularly because I was looking at the interlocutions between different camps within Indian feminism, particularly when the BBC documentary India's Daughter came out. There was this whole conversation about whether we should censor this film or not, and part of the reason was tied to the legality of all of that, because the people were the rapists were in process. And one of the important points that I politically aligned with within that chapter was with the Indian feminists, and particularly Nivita Menon, who talks about shaming these men rather than not, or hiding their names, or giving them the privacy afforded by the law, in order to, and in her words, in order to recognize who our enemy is, and combat that, rather than say, oh, this doesn't happen. Because one of the discourses on the other side, also coming from Indian feminism, and Kavita Krishnan talks about this, some of you might know her work. She says that there's this whole orientalizing trope within the film against Indian men, which is a complex question, no doubt, because here what you have is the post-colonial question treading on the question of feminism very neatly. And in that chapter particularly, and in relation to Joe's comments around sex work particularly, you see feminists such as, and I talk about this in that chapter, Sarojini Naidu, disavow feminism, saying that actually, and as you mentioned, like not just Gandhi, but Ambedkar as well disavowed sex work, right? So shame in those deployments is very much used, to suppress, right? Whereas in this articulation of Indian feminism, to say, let's shame them for what they have done and who they are and how they have internalized these norms, there's a different kind of articulation that does not subscribe to that other side of it. But I don't know, Joe, if you want to say more in relation to that.
I think I was just more thinking about the guilt aspect of it, and you're right. Yes, what power or transformative power does guilt have? And I was thinking about Savarna guilt, cis guilt, whatever. I'm not convinced that guilt has a transformative power, because that, from what I've seen and from my experiences in just like lived life, guilt breeds performative actions, not solidarity.
Guilt, just shame.
Right.
I meant like guilt is a cover to avoid
Right.
shame.
Okay, then I have no answer.
Do either of you want to?
I mean, I can give you a fun answer to that. Someone once said, Dipesh Chakraborty might not have been able to provincialize Europe, but definitely globalize the Bengali. But so it's a good thing that's been kind of gone away. But just in relation to your question about homonormativity, I think what's been really interesting in terms of queer activisms in India, and again, there are people in this panel who'll be able to also speak onto it. It's always been one that has been led by kind of respectable upper caste people of a certain class, and they've always been kind of we are the voice. That's always been the case. That's never changed. And one of the things is really that we are kind of seeing more and more these days, especially when it is coming to trans activisms within certain quarters, is this sort of imbrication with Hindutva ideology, and where someone needs to write a book about this, really, about the ways in which kind of RSS and Hindutva ideology has become so kind of key part of some of these sort of formations that's been happening. And of course, there is pushback to some extent, but not as much. But also, like caste, even until like 5 years ago, it was like, it was one of the things that you would absolutely not be speaking about. It wasn't like not something that we even, and looking at like, so kind of my research on digital queer cultures, it was not uncommon to see, profiles after profiles, which was about speak the correct English, which was like really a very class identifier that you should be able to speak English, or the fact, or just kind of, Brahmins and only, so that's always been the case. It's not been, it's just that now I guess most people are speaking out against it than it ever was. So it's always been very kind of homonormative. The whole recently about the fight for same-sex marriage, which has been, under a lot of backlash from queer activists. It's like, Tuparna's response in South Africa, which was like, literally there is no law, there is no kind of welfare state already. There's, policy intervention does not lead to social change. And, we are talking about same-sex marriage. How many people are going to even kind of, be part of that? So it's always been the case.
May I just add to that conversation? I'm writing something new about respectable queers in India in particular. And it's something that you're talking about. It's so complicated, for example, right? In India, it is very difficult to be a queer person. So when I talk to young men who have very homophobic families, they cannot tell their families that they are gay, right? Sometimes normativity becomes a shield for them, right? Normativity can also act as a cover for them, right? So I have in this paper that I'm writing, to be respectable, these young men are talking about how they don't want to disappoint their mother, or how they don't want to disappoint their parents, because they are already doing something wrong by leading these gay lives, right? These are people who are actually out or not quite out, and they need to get corporate jobs in order to sort of make a success of them. So how do we think about the paradoxes where sometimes queer people are using normativity or the norms of masculinity only to fit in, right? It is almost a site of not a resistance, perhaps a site of a shield, perhaps, a mask, or some kind of way of accessing a world that is left for them, right? So I think particularly in the global south, in the post-colonial context, where the inequalities are so deep and so profound, it's quite complex for me to say that, you should not be a homonormative queer to the young man who's desperate to get a job at PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, right? Or he's trying to get a corporate job somewhere else. So what comment or what critique could I make to him about the norms that he should be challenging or should not be challenging, right? And so when I've interviewed these people, they're in these corporate offices and they're very clear that, if I become too queer, I'm never going to get a job and I'm never going to go up the ladder. And it's a compromise. I'm not sure if it's a compromise, but so I don't
Negotiation.
A negotiation, perhaps. So there is absolutely some cashing in from the power of normativity, but also is there something else that's going on that's also complicating what the norm is and who's doing the normative work, right?
Yeah, and your proximity to how well you can inhabit that, dispossession, right? And I think just in terms of like sort of both responding to what everyone said and Fahad and Anis, your questions, I think one of the things that is quite interesting to think with or how normativity works, and I try to do this in my work through Queer Asia, actually, where I've sort of done some work with, it's quite interesting because when you're doing this work, and Shannon was there when we did the screening of a film festival program from the Queer Asia Film Festival in Delhi at the Delhi LGBTQ Center, but we weren't allowed to advertise what the films were and what they were about and how we could do this. But the discourse, and when we sat in those conversations, was so expansive for many reasons, because part of the mainstream narrative that we're getting, or the mainstreaming, or the homo nationalist sort of gaze that have, become part and parcel of the cultural, South Asian public culture in those ways, whether it's producing film or showing up or on, news channels, or, their quips and quotes in newspapers. All of that has become the dominant narrative. Whereas these films suddenly bring back this transgressive, this question that you can think about these things and you can challenge them rather than accept them and internalize them and take them as given. So for me, it's been quite useful to think about it in terms of practice, and of course informed by the research and the work. Yeah.
And also, just to add that there are some groups that are never going to be part of the norm, no matter how much they try, right? So sex workers are very clearly, they understand that no matter what happens, even if, let's say, sex work gets decriminalized in India, which is what they really want, even if that happens, they're never going to actually be the norm, because the ingrainment of the norm is so deep. That's not going to happen. On top of that, most of the sex workers I work with are also Dalit women. So, they know exactly where the line is, they know exactly what to play, and they know exactly where to challenge what. Because they already know that in the global sex worker identity, their local identities don't exactly match. A lot of their lived experiences of the everyday are flattened under the sex worker identity. And so a lot of my work with them is just putting those kinks back of what is the sex worker identity, who is the Jono Karmi, who is this person who's living that life every day. So they know that they're not part of the norm, but they also know when to deploy the term sex worker, when to get money, when to get funding, and at what point to drop that off at the door and live their lives.
Thank you. I want to get a few more questions, if possible. I know there's one here, there's one here, there's one there. Can I just have a sense of how many more people would like to ask a question? Just so I know how much time to give. Okay, there's one. Oh, is that okay? Quick questions, please, and can I ask for quick answers? Thank you. Sorry, but I want to hear from as many people as possible. So.
Okay, thank you. My question is about, Danny, what you said in your introduction about kind of the two aspects that you trace normativity with, which is on one hand kind of that which obscures its own reproduction, but then on the other hand, you mentioned this kind of common Hindi phrase, and the way you said it had a certain kind of power and life between it, within it. And Rohit, what you talked about with changing Facebook pictures, going to the gym, sex work is being excluded from kind of certain spaces. Those are very active things. That is an act that happens. Going to the gym is very hard work, So I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to kind of the way that normativity reproduces itself in these obscure and inactive ways, and then also the kind of activity that happens, or the acts that, make that happen. I'm not sure if that made sense. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. I found particularly interesting that Shannon mentioned if somebody is too queer, so we're coming back to queerness being something quantifiable. And I wanted to ask two things. One is towards Daniel, if you think that normativity goes into layers, because normativity includes probably nationality, religion, sexuality, and so on, multiple layers of one's identity. And if you think that punishment towards that has also different kind of layers towards which specific norms you are transgressing. And my other question, which is kind of intertwined, is when it comes to masculinity, what is the role, because I'm not aware of the local context in India, or maybe local contexts in plural, what is the role of religion in masculinity in India specifically, and what about non-Hindu identities?
I'm 17. I'm a queer teen who actually grew up in India until 2021. So a lot of this resonates with me a lot. So I wanted to thank you for that. My question might not be as academic because I'm still in high school, but I wanted to ask, for a small while during the beginning of lockdown, I think there was like a bit of a, like, I was still there in India, so there was a bit of a rise in kind of like feminism and stuff like that. Guys around me started to become more acceptable of like LGBTQ people and start to care about women's rights, etc. But then suddenly there was a rise in figures like Andrew Tate and people like that, which started to increase to like reduce all we had built up to at that point. So there was again an increase in homophobia, toxic masculinity, transphobia, etc. So and now even as well, there's a lot of idealization of people like Trump as well, with my friend, like people I was friends with over there. So how do you think that is going to progress, and how do you think we can tackle it?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have one more question, and this is unfortunately going to be the last one. So I'm literally going to give you like 30 seconds each. Yes, sorry. Person with the pink scarf.
Hi, thanks, Danny. Thanks for your talk. I'll be very brief. I mean, this is also coming from this understanding that one of the most crucial sides for the making of the normative and the contra-normative are currently the educational spaces in India. And that's where also the public culture, the engagement with digital, and given that our educational spaces have changed in the last 1 decade, we are no more, the idea of university is no more the same in India. So I wanted to get some sense from you or any of the panelists, in what ways do educational spaces and their role in steering the idea of the normative, as well as them as being sites for the making of contra-normative, how does that figure? Just to give you a little bit of context, I teach sociology at IIT Delhi, and it's my first day in London.
Amazing. Well, thank you for all of those really, really good questions. I'm going to try and do a 30.
We have to finish
Yes.
at 7, and you need
Yes.
to introduce books.
Yes, so very quickly, 30 seconds. I think in many ways, that last question that you've asked, it actually touches on some of these questions that you've asked. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. But, you know, and the book in the second chapter on Tagore, it actually looks at that university syllabuses. It looks at the production of the normal, because what I'm really interested in that chapter is to look at how we're being taught to read. And there's this whole section where I look at the work that Spivak was doing with teachers in primary schools in rural Bengal to talk about how, you know, even the idea of meaning is failing in the educational apparatus. So I look very much at reading cultural artifacts as a process of the education apparatus and how it, you know, instructs us. So when you come to these questions or these figures like Andrew Tate, they're all, co-opting a certain medium, a certain platform in order to create a certain kind of educational, well, at least that's my reading of it, educational. I don't think it's educational in the same way as I'm using the word, but you know, they have a following, they create a brand around themselves, and that is used to instruct or inform. So you know, just coming back to this normativity being embedded in the education system, I think it was quite interesting when you had a person like Khushwant Singh, who is a very famous writer in India, critique Tagore, saying he was not that great writer, and everyone from the right to the left to the far right to the far left said, oh my God, how could you say that about Tagore? What does that mean? That means all of them have been educated on how to read Tagore in a specific way, which is why that chapter is called How to Read Tagore Wrong, right? I'm trying to unread or read against the grain in that instance.
Danny, I'm sorry.
Yes. Okay.
I'm sorry, but only
Yes,
because
no,
I
of
know
course.
that you want
Yes,
to.
yes, yes.
Just, I'm going to finish this part of the discussion now. I'm sorry, but the time has caught up with us. I want to say a huge thank you to you all for an amazing conversation, and then I'm going to hand over to Danny, who just has a couple of other things to say. But thank you so much.
So I'm just also very keen to introduce Agiva, who is here, and I wanted to just mention that a lot of the writing of this book was done during the pandemic, and Giva, who runs Kohol, organized this writing circle. Some of the members of the writing circle are here as well, so that's just incredible. So this book wouldn't have been possible also without Kohol. So I wanted to do, there are book copies for sale here, but I wanted to say that, part of the proceeds from the book sale go to Kohol that's doing a fundraiser, and I want to hand over to Giva just to say a little bit about Kohol as well.
Thank you, Danny. I just want to add that I met you in the context of Queer Asia, and it was my first time in London. It was in 2016, and I didn't know I had my place in a festival like Queer Asia, so thank you for giving me that wrong geographical reading, which is also a wrong way of reading the world. And I think this is very important for what we're doing today and why we are doing this fundraiser. I'll be quick because I know we don't have time. Kohol lost 2/3 of its funding since October 2023 because of our work on Palestine. And I think linking that to your work and to your book, it is about the necessity and the commitment to wrong readings against what we are told is the normal, when the normal is unbearable and unimaginable. So this is what we've been trying to do at Kohol, a queer journal that is transnational in scope, but that has its heart in anti-colonial work in the global south. And also to link it to the idea of queerness and the co-optation of queerness in relation to funding, which has become a colonial tool and has always been. It's not new, but I think it's very in our face at the moment. It's about co-optation, as you say in your book, but not just in terms of identity, but in terms of positionality. So what is now being read as wrong is anti-colonial queerness and not queerness in terms of its iterations and manifestations and how identity politics are being assimilated into systems of power and colonial states. So thank you so much for your gesture in terms of donating to Kohol. We have a crowdfunding campaign that is ongoing. We have a fundraiser tomorrow. And I hope we can continue doing this work in any form and format possible, because we need to read the world wrong. And thank you so much for your